Hey everybody, and welcome to Database Camp. My name is Sarah, and today I'm going to be continuing my reading of Racism in America. So if you wanted to know a little bit more background about the book, what inspired me to make this series, and if you also wanted to listen to me reading the foreword, then it's going to be in the first video of this series. So I'm going to link that video down below in the description box if you wanted a little bit more background. But if you're aware of what the series is all about, then just keep on watching because I'm going to read the third excerpt in this book. The third excerpt is titled, Violence Over the Land, Indians and Empires in the Early American West, by Ned Blackhawk. So a little bit of background. In a book that ranges across Utah, Nevada, New Mexico, Colorado, and Eastern California, a region known as the Great Basin, Ned Blackhawk chronicles 2 centuries of native and imperial history that profoundly shaped the American West. Focusing on Ute, Paiute, and Shoshone Indians, he explores the central role violence played in colonial expansion, a reminder of the high costs it occasioned for many indigenous peoples. Here, Blackhawk discusses the challenges confronting Ute leaders in the aftermath of the Mexican-American War, as they tried to negotiate relations with the newly victorious Americans while still maintaining control of their homelands. An important strand in the region's historical tapestry, the settlement of the San Luis Valley occurred during the turbulent years of American rule, when foreign armies, officials, and migrants swarmed across the Arkansas and down the Rio Grande. After meeting with U.S. officials in September and October 1846, 100 Ute leaders concluded that the new regime in Santa Fe would meet their community's needs. The assurances, however, also came with prohibitions. Plied with blankets, gifts, and bonds mots, Ute leaders listened to the first of many calls to abate their violence. Peace was to be a precondition for diplomatic relations. Ute leaders had conducted negotiations in Santa Fe before, pledging peace to Spanish and Mexican governors. Such times, however, were now gone. While U.S. negotiations with Indians resembled prior gatherings, the distinctions involved more than linguistics, because the pledge of peace that the Americans now required involved more than an end to violence. In September and October, respectively, General Stephen Kearny and Colonel Alexander Doniphan conducted negotiations as agents of an expanding national state. Their treaty negotiations became the first step toward consolidating control over Ute lands, and their capacity to deploy violence to such ends contrasted with that of Santa Fe's earlier rulers. The first 2 years of Ute diplomacy with these new leaders held little portent of the revolutions to come. While Utes facilitated settlement in the San Luis, continued trading on the Arkansas, and even aided American explorers, including Fremont's ill-fated 4th expedition in the San Juan Mountains, the U.S. Army maintained a continental operation. In addition to occupying Mexico's capital and California, the Army faced Indians throughout the West whose attacks plunged many newly conquered lands into chaos. Having pledged peace to Kearny and Doniphan, Ute leaders generally remained aloof from larger conflicts, choosing neutrality as a strategy for maintaining control over their mountain homelands. This policy potentially served Ute bands well, for the widening Indian wars drew many of the Utes' principal rivals, Arafos and Cheyennes on the plains, Navajos in the southwest, into bitter campaigns of survival that would last until 1864, when nearly simultaneously Navajos were removed by the Long Walk to Bosque Redondo, and Cheyenne blood ran deep at Sand Creek. Except for the easternmost Muache Utes, who raided with Jicarilla Apaches, most Ute bands understood that neutrality ensured continued autonomy. Besides, Ute dominion over breakaway New Mexican villagers seemed destined to increase the number of settlements that they could tax in times of need. For most Utes, maintaining peace with Americans while maintaining control over their homelands extended survival strategies forged in the early 1840s. But the new American prohibitions were broader than the Utes had realized. Although U.S. officials countenanced intertribal raids, they were not prepared to tolerate Indian attacks against white migrants or resident New Mexicans. In early 1849, after a winter attack by Arapajos, Utes escalated their raids upon El Rio Colorado in order to replace lost resources and honor. The practices of taxing New Mexicans had sustained them well following Martinez's attack and had led to the formation of breakaway communities in their midst. When needed, Utes made off with thousands of sheep and goats, dozens of cows, cattle, and horses, as well as a few burros, leaving village pantries depleted. Unfortunately for the Utes, the new regime in Santa Fe had created avenues of redress for even the most distant New Mexicans. Upon hearing of Ute raids upon the territory, U.S. officials concluded that the Utes had violated their pledge of peace, and in March 1849, they mobilized a reprisal force. As Janet Lecomte details, Lieutenant J.H. Whittlesey has sent out with 57 soldiers to chastise the Utes. The soldiers surprised a village, killed 10 braves, captured 2 women and a chief's son, and destroyed 50 lodges with all the provisions. The soldiers, according to another scholar, drove the remaining Indians like chickens in all directions through the snow. As Ute survivors jettisoned supplies and stock needed to survive the mountain winter. Later that month, when 2 of Fremont's guides returned to Colorado to retrieve cached supplies from their expedition in the San Juans, Utes exacted prompt revenge, killing Dr. Benjamin Kern and former trapper Bill Williams, whose familiarity with Ute ways had once enabled him to navigate the borderlands to the northwest. In what was to become a common recurrence, the first military campaign between Utes and the U.S. Army stemmed from deep-seated economic needs as well as misperceptions. Utes understood that their leaders had pledged peace with U.S. officials who threatened retaliation for Ute violence. They misunderstood, however, the new definitions of violence in the region. Visitors to El Rio Colorado, such as Roxton, as well as the new villagers along the San Luis, all understood that Utes' threats or uses of violence stemmed from economic need. In the face of mounting economic pressure and intertribal warfare, Utes taxed New Mexicans as well as Euro-American migrants within their homelands by seizing crops, cattle, and goods. While Roxton had noted thousands of antelope along the Front Range, he also detailed the region's dwindling bison population, as did chroniclers of Colorado's Hispano villages, whose herds ruptured bison ecologies. Colorado Utes were thus simultaneously fighting rivals for access to diminishing bison herds and raiding villagers in times of scarcity. Both strategies were economic in nature, though violent in form, and now U.S. officials insisted that Utes end such violence. Eliminate your raiding economies, curtail the forms of survival that you have developed, and come to depend upon us for your community needs. Had Ute leaders fully understood the nature of U.S. demands, their use of violence might have come much earlier or more selectively. Had U.S. leaders understood Ute economic challenges, Whittlesey's destruction of 50 Ute lodges in the winter of 1849 might have been averted. News of Whittlesey's attack spread throughout adjacent Ute communities. Fugitive survivors invariably detailed the rapidity with which the Americans advanced through the snow. The white newcomers' horses, efficient rifles, and uniformed cavalry units presented a sharp contrast with Mexican and Spanish forces. As harrowing tales fueled community debates about appropriate responses, Ute leaders quelled calls for reprisal. Now was not the time for violence, they insisted. The American numbers were already too great, and the next force might be even larger. The use of force must be a last resort, one that must be weighed against all other options. Besides, with Ute arms and ammunition so under-provisioned, there would be few chances of success against such might. A direct confrontation with this army, even in the face of such humiliation, was not warranted. Though undocumented, such logic undoubtedly circulated throughout Ute diplomatic channels in 1849. For in the months after the attack, Ute envoys, and not warriors, filtered into New Mexico, spreading reassuring words of their leaders' commitments to peace. By year's end, as they had for generations, Ute leaders assembled en masse and headed south to enter into what they believed would be a permanent agreement with Indian agents newly stationed in the region, the leader of whom, James S. Calhoun, possessed congressional authority to negotiate peace with the region's Indian powers. By responding to American military violence with diplomatic instead of military initiatives, Utes positioned themselves to create a more stable future, initiating a 20-year ordeal to resolve their endemic subsistence and political problems. On New Year's Day, 1850, after 6 months in office, New Mexico's Indian agent James Calhoun wrote to Commissioner of Indian Affairs Orlando Brown. Determined to secure peace treaties with Navajo, Ute, and Apache leaders, Calhoun noted that he had not the slightest doubt that many have attempted a coalition for the purpose of overrunning and ravaging this territory. If that purpose is abandoned or has been defeated, he continued, it is the result of the Utah's influence over the wild tribes. Despite constant efforts to convince them otherwise, Calhoun related, Apaches and Navajos could not prevent the Utah chiefs from meeting with me at Abiquiu. Reflecting his annoyance at earlier failures to cement negotiations with Utes, Calhoun's letter was written after an eventful 72 hours, having sent messengers north in early December, inviting Ute leaders to Abiquiu later in the month. The Indian agent arrived on December 28th and learned that Ute leaders were indeed only a few miles outside the gateway into New Mexico. Such proximity, however, also bred anxiety, for the Ute delegation did not come into the village on that day or the next, choosing instead to socialize with Abiquiu's traders whose influence tested Calhoun's patience. On the evening of December 29, when a Ute leader begged Calhoun to be patient, Calhoun responded with an ultimatum. I would wait until the ensuing midday, and not a moment longer, for the chiefs to come in. And by 10 o'clock on the next morning, they were present, and the enclosed treaty was fully and thoroughly explained to them. These brief glimpses of the creation of the first congressionally ratified treaty between Utes and the U.S. government underscore the challenges confronting American officials and Indian leaders after the U.S.-Mexican War. Fearing indigenous alliances and insurrections, anxious agents invited Indians to negotiate favorable conditions of peace rather than suffer through campaigns of war. While Indian leaders attempted to use agency resources for their needs. Despite Apache and Navajo appeals, Ute leaders understood the necessity and rewards of diplomacy. They could not, however, fully control their community's actions. The familiar allures of trade, friendship, and holiday festivities almost compromised their primary intentions. Formalizing political and diplomatic agreements was an ordeal all its own. Doing so in concert with other community needs also deepened the challenge. Ratified by Congress on September 9, 1850, the first Utah Treaty had 29 principal and subordinate Ute chief signatories, and in the next weeks, other Ute leaders came to New Mexico and signed on the settlement, unconditionally submitted to the power and authority of the U.S. government in Article 1. Utes agreed in the following articles to cease hostilities, to restore stolen property and captives, and to allow free white passage through their lands. In return, the U.S. government agreed to provide them with trading houses, military agencies, and annuities, as well as to establish clearly demarcated Ute territorial boundaries. Ute leaders agreed to this last provision reluctantly, for Article 7 called for more than the creation of Ute reservations. It also called for Utes' confinement within such boundaries and the cultivation of reserved lands. Utes were to become not only residents of a demarcated territory, but also farmers upon it. They were, as the treaty dictated, to cease the roving and rambling habits which have hitherto marked them as a people. When Ute leaders expressed their utter aversion to labor and inquired what they would do to sustain life, if so restricted, Calhoun replied to them, if they behave well, the government would take care of them, and that if they thought they ought not to agree to the terms of the treaty, that I would, at the peril of my life, secure them transit to their own country unmolested and unharmed. Faced with Calhoun's assurances, Ute leaders accepted the overall tenor of the negotiations, understanding that future compromises would be necessary to retain control over their homelands. In retrospect, Ute acceptance of U.S. dominion in the 1850 treaty appears as the first step in a long march toward dispossession, a fateful indigenous miscalculation of epic proportions. Such hindsight, however, is both misguided and unhelpful. Facing their own harrowing challenges, Ute signatories understood that fulfilling their treaty commitments was a key to survival, a willingness and commitment that Calhoun and others repeatedly noted. The Utahs seem to be quiet, and no one has recently complained of their conduct. Calhoun wrote in October 1850, Utes accepted, by and large, the treaty's provisions and remained for 4 years. As acting superintendent of Indian Affairs, John Greiner wrote in April 1852, the easiest managed of any Indians in the territory, and with good treatment can always be relied upon. Even the most militant Muache leaders, including the notorious Chico Velasquez, who boasted of attacks against whites and Mexicans, aided New Mexican officials. Velasquez and 7 other leaders promised in 1850 never again to take up arms against the people of the United States, either Americans or Mexicans. Repeated and effusive remarks about Ute conduct then characterized American correspondence in the early 1850s and contrasted with officials' assessments of the territory's other Indian powers. Utes' compliance, however, went only so far. It taxed both their resolve and resources. Notwithstanding Calhoun's and Griner's hopeful reports, the challenge of maintaining peace in the face of escalating economic pressures cast Ute leaders into a series of deepening dilemmas. While committed to peace and hopeful that promised annuities would be forthcoming, Utes watched as marauding Plains Indians continued their incursions into Ute homelands. They also saw uninvited settlers move farther up the Rio Grande onto disputed land grants established in the last years of Mexican rule. Most of all, they waited for the treaties' promised agencies, supplies, and provisions to arrive in their hungry communities, and Ute patience grew weaker with each season. At the end of 1850, Calhoun reported that Utahs seem to be perfectly quiet and say they are waiting to ascertain what their great father will do for them. 7 months later, in July 1851, he continued, "The Utahs, I have reason to believe, are submissive, patiently waiting to see what our government will do with them and for them." 3 months later, Griner pleaded to Calhoun, "The Utahs are peaceably and kindly disposed toward our citizens and have behaved well," noting 2 earlier attacks by Kiowa and Arapajos and the Utes' subsequent preparations for reprisal. Griner concluded, "I know of no remedy to check these outrages." Calhoun repeatedly requested additional military units to enforce U.S. Indian policy. One letter to the White House in 1850 pleading for assistance was co-signed by more than 50 New Mexicans. "We shall never have protection and quiet in this territory," it claimed, until equestrian Indians are confined and forced to remain in certain fixed limits. Unfortunately for Calhoun and expectant Ute leaders, the messy aftermath of conquest overstretched the capacity of the federal government's Indian office. Article 7's provision for a demarcated Ute homeland, for example, would take a generation to implement. An agent in an underfunded, overextended agency, Calhoun witnessed ebbs and flows in his attempts to channel the region's historical antagonists into the mainstream of U.S. governance. For Utes, rising expectations and government failures to fulfill fundamental American promises culminated in their abrogation of the landmark treaty. When exactly Utes abandoned diplomacy in favor of violence is unclear. Why they did so is not. Although Calhoun and Griner noted occasional depredations by Ute raiders, most Colorado Utes remained committed to peace. American attention to Ute affairs, however, was too inconsistent, poorly planned, and uneven to assure that these commitments endured. Ute leaders were angered not only by the many years it took officials to establish promised forts, agencies, and annuity distributions, but also by the perceived favoritism shown to their many rivals. In contrast to Calhoun, with his aversion to bribery and his perception that intentions and not presence best oiled the wheels of Indian diplomacy, Indian agents on the plains readily trafficked in powder, ammunition, and guns with the Utes' primary rivals, arming Kiowa, Arapaho, and Cheyenne warriors with the technologies of violence essential to warfare. In the treaties of Fort Laramie and Fort Atkinson, Plains Indian signatories received more gifts, supplies, and annuities than had Utes, for whom powder and ammunition were harder to obtain. Furthermore, Wild traders on the plains continued to trade with their many rivals. In New Mexico, Calhoun moved to curtail unlicensed trading to the north, limiting the familiar illicit trade between northern villages and Ute communities. In short, American rule favored certain Indians over others, and American authority emanated north from Santa Fe in uneven waves. Signs of Ute disaffection were evident throughout 1854, particularly after the fateful death of Chico Velasquez, whose services on behalf of Governor David Meriwether had earned him accolades and gifts. Helping to retrieve stolen horses and cattle, Velasquez and his fellow tribesman Tamuche had also participated in a manhunt for a suspected murderer. Being paid each a gray cloth coat, decorated handsomely with red and yellow braid, these Ute leaders returned home fashionably attired in tailored officers' clothing. They had also just contracted smallpox, and many came to the conclusion that the superintendent was the cause of the disease being among them. Every one that received a coat died. The following spring, scattered and diseased, Ute remains greeted travelers along the San Luis River. Combined with other grievances, such disaffection reached fever pitch on Christmas Eve 1854. Moache leader Tierra Blanco and 100 warriors rode roughshod over the Arkansas, killing 20 at El Pueblo and taking 3 captives before launching winter campaigns against Colorado's most vital artery. Enlisting the support of Arapaho and Cheyenne allies, William Bent endured months of Ute raids, while less protected settlements disbanded and fled. Conducting reprisals out of Fort Massachusetts, the only fort in Colorado, which Utes had complained was too far south on the San Luis to protect them from Plains raiders, U.S. Army Colonel Thomas Fauntleroy pursued Moache, Capote, and Jicarilla bands throughout 1855, destroying lodges, capturing more than 50 women and children, and burning tons of Ute saddles, robes, and material. Capote and Jicarilla bands throughout 1855, destroying lodges, capturing more than 50 women and children, and burning tons of Ute saddles, robes, and material. Fauntleroy's men also disfigured Ute victims, while several Ute mothers reportedly made a greater sacrifice, painfully enduring the self-imposed deaths of their own children rather than see them lost to invaders. Such campaigns, Meriwether summarized, caused these Indians great loss and suffering, and in August, new treaties were signed at Abiquiu, treaties designed to ensure that the violent disagreements of the last half-decade would find other forms of resolution. Conducted under the shadow of American guns, the renewed negotiations did not proceed in the optimistic spirit that characterized Calhoun's efforts in 1849. Moreover, Senate failure to ratify the new agreements prolonged U.S. fulfillment of the 1850 treaty for another decade. Waiting for American officials to meet their commitments had fueled past violence. Now more waiting seemingly augured more returns to the battlefield. Colorado Utes, however, chose a different path. Never again would they initiate concerted military campaigns against the American state. Instead, their commitments to peace inaugurated a new era in Ute diplomacy. Ironically, U.S. military officials would soon create fertile avenues of service for Ute warriors, and Utes guided and rode alongside those who had just attacked them on the San Luis. After 1855, Ute diplomacy helped abate economic and ecological stresses, a new generation of Ute leaders came to know and even trust the authorities with whom they negotiated, and they believed them when, in 1868, they finally said that the Utes' mountain homelands would remain theirs until the end of time. That was Violence Over the Land, Indians and Empires in the Early American West by Ned Blackhawk. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to give it a like. I want to hear your comments down below, and subscribe to the channel because I would really appreciate it. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll be seeing you in the next one. Bye guys. Also, I might have mispronounced a few of the words there, so pardon me on that.